Matthew 14, 1 through 12 is where I'm going to read. Our lesson today is John the Baptist beheaded. So we'll see where we get to go with this. There's a lot of things we can say about it. You may think of even more after we get through the lesson. But I'm going to start reading at Matthew 14, verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her brother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter, given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and they told Jesus. Boy, this is quite a story. So let's dive in here and see what is going on. This is at the time of Herod the Tetrarch. Herod descended, of course, from Herod the Great. You had 5 different rulers that descended from Herod the Great. And as we think about this time, we're jolted in the story of Matthew that such a terrible scene was presented without some sort of warning or introduction. Now, we see previous to this, we talked a little bit about where Jesus is a prophet without honor in his own country. So there are people that were not receiving him well. But then the story shifts to Herod the Tetrarch. He's heard reports about Jesus, and he thinks that Jesus really is John the Baptist. And that's why this chapter shifts a little bit to give you the background as to why Herod thinks this. So we ask the question, how does this episode fit into the story of Jesus? And is there any good news in this narrative? A lot of times we ask the question, is there anything about the gospel that we can discover from this particular episode? And how is this to serve as a message to the early church and to the present church? What are we to get out of this? One thing that was interesting, I searched high and low on the internet to come up with a good picture about John being beheaded. 99.9% of them were too gruesome to put up on the screen. So I thought I'll spare us all of those pictures. But this is something that happened that is not good. And we're going to ask the question, what message is this supposed to send? And we're going to see some of the dynamics going on. And we're going to get to see what kind of leader Herod was and what kind of person John the Baptist was. These are very important things to think about. So we know that Jesus' reputation has spread. Herod has the wrong identification of who he is, but notice that he connects to Jesus and John the Baptist, making that connection that he's risen from the dead. Well, he thought that he had been risen from the dead. There was some idea even back then that, of course, it would not have been as much fleshed out as the Christian view of resurrection, but he felt that John the Baptist has come from the dead, and he connects it to the miraculous powers that are at work in him. This is an amazing phrase, especially from someone that didn't believe in Jesus. But when we look at the gospel and we see Jesus being presented, that's a beautiful phrase to describe what Jesus is doing. The miraculous powers are at work in him. That's true. Now, what we don't know is what some of the stories are that Herod had heard about Jesus. But whatever he heard, he connected to that miraculous powers that are at work in him. That's why when we study the Gospels and we answer or seek to answer the question, who is Jesus? We cannot, in fact, the Gospels don't present it this way. We cannot come away with a picture of Jesus that he's just a prophet with no powers. He is one who was resurrected from the dead, and he has miraculous powers that are at work, and they demonstrate very clearly in his ministry what he could do. He thought John the Baptist was risen from the dead, as we've just mentioned. And these miraculous powers, sometimes in the ancient world, people would look at them as in a very superstitious way. So we don't know all of the things that obviously Herod was thinking about these miraculous powers, but he is certainly impressed by them, and it's what he remembers. Jesus' reputation has spread. Well, Herod arrested John, and he bound him and he put him in prison. So, in spite of the fact that he believed, well, let's say it this way, he's arrested John because of the message that John has been preaching. And we're going to see what this is. But Herod bound him and he arrested him. So in the ancient world, when someone was bound and arrested, there was no way for them to escape from being in that condition. But notice, John spoke the truth to power. This is what got him in trouble. Here it is, a leader. He's in a position of power. And he's speaking truth to something that Herod must have felt like it wasn't any of John's business. You ever heard the old-fashioned expression, it's okay to preach, but when you start stepping on my toes, that's when we get into trouble. Well, John the Baptist stepped on Herod's toes because he's going to address something that is not as it should be. Notice very carefully, his brother, he was put in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for John had been saying to him, so here's the content of John's message. It's not lawful for you to have her. So he was in a marriage relationship that wasn't lawful, and it was unlawful on two occasions. In Jewish civil law, and just in regular Greek and Roman law, this was really not to be allowed, but also in God's economy for marriage, the way God had set up the covenant of marriage. Herod had taken Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. John spoke to that. It makes you aware that not everyone since the beginning, and of course we're studying Genesis, we've already seen that. From the beginning, God created male and female, and for them to be one as husband and wife. When that original plan is not followed, all kinds of sinful things can happen. Herod did not like John's preaching. In fact, it says Herod wanted to kill John. Now, that stands in the long line of faithful prophets. Even in the Old Testament, prophets who proclaimed the will of God, standing up against leaders who were not only living sinful lives, but taking advantage of people for their own purposes. Many of the prophets died. And many times the prophet would speak the word of God, knowing that they weren't going to live after they spoke the word. Now, in this case, Herod wanted to kill John. Now, I don't know if at that point he made it known to John, but he wanted to, and because of the message. But look at what happened. When he is duplicitous in the fact that, yeah, he wants to kill John, but guess what? He is a person that is in true political power. He's afraid of the people. That if he were to reach out and just kill John, what would happen to him with the uproar of the people? Because they considered him to be a prophet. So the people in general, when they had heard some of John's teaching and they knew something about him, they had a little bit different view of John the Baptist than Herod did. Herod didn't like what John was saying, but he was afraid of the people, as they considered him to be a prophet, which meant that they could tell he was proclaiming and preaching the faithful will of God, even though Herod was not living according to the will of God. And let's look a moment at Herod's oath. On his birthday, now this is very typical. In the ancient world, when leaders would have a birthday, they would throw a bash you can't believe. If you read about the Roman emperors, civil leaders, it was just kind of the tradition in the ancient world. If you had a birthday and you were in any kind of a leadership role, people would really have a big bash for you. Well, on this occasion, the daughter of Herodias danced for them and pleased Herod so much. I read where one commentator tried to say that there wasn't anything really bad with the dance. It was just and I'm like, that's not really how this sounds. Look at how this sounds. On his birthday, Herodias' daughter danced for them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. And I was thinking about that. Boy, what a dance that must have been. I'm glad we don't have it on video. Woo! You know? So he, in his role, he said, I'm just going to give you whatever you want. Oh boy. Well, prompted by her mother, because see, you can imagine how she felt knowing the message that John the Baptist was preaching. She didn't like it either. Well, she sees this as her opportunity. Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist. Yes. Now, I don't know where people get horrible ideas like this. Had she seen this some other time where somebody's head was presented on a platter to somebody else? I mean, where did people, what's the question? Nancy and I were talking about this the other day. Where do evil people get their ideas from? Where would she have, I mean, where would a normal person's mind have thought of something like this? But that's what she says. Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist. Then Herod has a response. He's distressed. Now, there's been a lot of commentary on what made him so distressed. He's in a spot here. He wanted to kill John, but because the people are like, no, I won't do it. But now he's caught. He's made this oath he can't get out of. In the ancient world, if you made an oath, you know, short of death, you kept your oath. Remember the story in the Old Testament about the rash vow. I mean, people would make vows that were rash, spur of the moment, but they had to keep them. So he's distressed because of his oath and his dinner guest. He ordered that her request be granted. So Herod then has to go ahead, keep his oath. So he had John beheaded in the prison. One of the things that's kind of also somewhat shocking at this point in the story, this would be the perfect place, you would think, for a whole lot of comment about what it means to be a martyr. What were some of John's final thoughts before his head came off? Did he have a final prayer he prayed before he was executed like this? You would think there'd be so many things that could add to the story, but it doesn't. It's almost like you got a short reporter's version of what happened, and that's it. No comment. Now, the reason I say that is because with it written that way, it invites you as the reader to kind of push the story back and think, okay, why was this story told? What is going on? And what should I think about this? The Gospels are like this. Both Jesus in his teaching and some of the stories in the Gospels make you think. The Bible makes us think. Have you ever caught on to that? The Bible makes us think. Some things aren't handed to us on a silver platter. We have to think through them. Well, we're getting ready to do that here in a moment. I want you to look at the action of John's disciples. After John was beheaded, it says the disciples came and they took his body and they buried it. And then last of all, they went and told Jesus. Now that's how the story ends. And I thought, okay, think about the honor that they wanted to afford the body of John. That in the ancient world, one of the most dishonorable things was to leave a human body not buried. So they wanted to honor John's body, but then they went and told Jesus. And these were John's disciples. Wonder why they went to Jesus. And that's a good question. We'll answer it here in a minute. They went and they told Jesus. Well, let's look at some of the things then. It raises the question, does Jesus care about what happens? We have a song in our songbook, don't we? Called Does Jesus Care? Did Jesus care about what happened to John? He sure did. And another thing we don't have, wouldn't you have loved to have been a fly on the wall when these disciples of John came to Jesus, told him what happened, and then his word of comfort and guidance for them through that tragedy? Can you only imagine what Jesus told them? So that sometime after the original event that actually happened with John the Baptist head, he was beheaded. It's written in such a way that we're supposed to pause and reflect on it. This is after the event. So what are we supposed to be thinking? John the Baptist paid with his life for speaking truth. You can see all through the Old Testament, several places in the New Testament, there is often a price that we have to pay when we speak the truth. Can't get around it. It's just the way it is. Especially if you've got people, we mentioned this the other night, remember from John 3. The Bible says there are some men who love darkness more than light. Well, people who love darkness, they're not going to want to hear the truth. And if they hear it, they're going to make you pay for speaking the truth. But it's a truth that we need to hear, that oftentimes when you speak truth, you'll have to pay for it. And duplicitous leaders allow evil to follow. Herod could have taken a different tack here. He could have, yeah, I know that I made an oath. It's going to look bad, but I know that it's wrong. I made a rash vow. I'm not going to keep it. I need to listen to John. He's right. I shouldn't have taken my brother Philip's wife, Herodias. I mean, he could have walked back and confessed everything. Well, that would have taken a tall person to do that. Herod wasn't willing to do any of that. And pleasure can lead to disastrous results. Herod was so pleased with that party and everything connected to it, and ultimately the dance by the daughter, he let that guide his own actions. Some people call it a life of hedonism. You just let what pleases you guide everything you do. And if it's not pleasurable, don't want to be a part of it. All I want is to have life that is fun, pleasurable, comfort, and it just sort of tends to the things I want to do. Well, Herod is an example of what can happen if you let that principle guide your life. It's going to back you into a corner, and as a result, he ended up approving something that was certainly wrong. But we notice also the honor of John's disciples. The thing that struck me this week, thinking about these disciples, they may have wrestled with the idea, well, if we come and get John's body, are we in danger too? Are we going to be beheaded if we try to go get his body? Who knows what they went through? But they were concerned about the honor of burying John the Baptist. So let's look at some practical application on this lesson. A paragraph that is quite graphic in many of its details. Does Jesus awaken our conscience? I think that Herod struggled a little bit with conscience, but not enough to make him change. And so when we're pricked in our conscience and we've said or done something that's based on either a life of pleasure, a life of power, however we want to live in such a way that is self-centered, does Jesus awaken our conscience? Are we ready to pay the price for speaking the truth? Are there people living around us that we need to say something? And you know that God's Spirit has put it on your heart, and you may be, think about how the prophetic, and this is interesting because this is what we talk about, the prophetic voice. Oftentimes the prophetic voice is spoken in a situation when nobody else wants to say anything, but everybody else knows there's an elephant in the room. And as a result, guess what? Are we ready to pay the price for speaking the truth, often to the elephant in the room? And we should never be afraid of the crowd if we're in the right. Herod was afraid of the crowd. Well, listen, as a Christian, we should never be afraid of the crowd. We don't care what people think. That's not what it's based on. Be careful the promises we make. Make sure they're not rash, so we'll be held to something terrible. And be careful what you promise. Think about those kind of things when we make those commitments. And then there's a powerful symbolism, I think, at the very end that certainly the early church and the church through the next few centuries would have heard. They went and they told Jesus. Jesus is the source of our comfort. When a tragedy like this happens, where do you go? Where did they go? They went to Jesus. It's one of the profound lessons out of all of this, even as bad as it was that John was beheaded. His disciples went through that tragedy, but where did they go? They went and they told Jesus. Here's the powerful insight. As a disciple, when I'm trying to follow Jesus, when I go through life, when things this horrible happen, where do I go? I don't go to despair. I don't blame anybody. A lot of different options. We go and we tell Jesus. I love the way that this ends because it becomes a model then for how we in our discipleship, following Jesus, how do we handle tragedies in our life? How do we handle when maybe we've spoken up for what's right and the truth and we had to pay for it? How do we handle when everybody's against us? How do we handle this? We go and we tell Jesus. I love this. So think about this narrative being included right here in Matthew and the powerful word it had for the early church When I say the early church, the church in the 60s and 70s, when most likely the Gospel of Matthew was written, for people that lived a generation after Jesus was on earth, what a great message of comfort this must have been at the end of the story. They went and told Jesus. And what's interesting is we find that John's death is vindicated by Jesus' resurrection. And it's interesting because even Herod himself thought of the idea of resurrection, but the Christian resurrection is the ultimate hope. So no matter how bad things look, no matter what tragedy may occur, behind all of it is the Christian hope of destiny, resurrection, and being with Jesus forever.